All right, everybody, good morning. Back with another reading hour. This is for July 9th, 2025. Turn on my noise canceling here. All right, the Instagram has caught up. I'll try to make a point to check the Instagram chat today. I noticed there were some people popping off there yesterday that I didn't see until the very end, so my apologies. But anyway, picking back up with the Gladio book. So we left off yesterday on a section called The Dirty War. Let's see, let me just make sure my audio is coming through. Yeah. And so I had left off talking about how the Dirty War basically was a great catch-all term to describe the clandestine nature of these underground militant operations, these secret organizations that were actually running the governments of many European countries, that were controlling the worldwide narcotics and drug trafficking industries, and then using the funds from that to do these clandestine operations. But anyway, picking back up on this section, the Dirty War. But no Latin American country, not even Pinochet's Chile, could equal the levels of violence that followed the military coup of March 24th, 1976 in Argentina. Indeed, the only regime to create a state of fear approximating that of Argentina was Hitler's Germany. There were other parallels to Nazism, including a government-sponsored hate campaign against the country's 400,000 Jews. As many as 30,000 political prisoners, including students, union organizers, journalists, and even pregnant women, were killed or disappeared during the 1976 to 1983, quote, Dirty War, which was fully endorsed by the Ford, Carter, and Reagan administrations. So yeah, catch that. That's three different administrations that all co-signed this war. These like massive, it's like literally a genocide. Political killings took place on the average of 7 a day in 1977. Nor were Argentines the only victims. An estimated 14,000 refugees from other South American military regimes were told to leave the country or face the possibility of arrest. Torture was automatic for anyone arrested, according to a spokesman for the World Council of Churches. Yeah, it's crazy. Torture was just automatic for anyone arrested. It's weird to just like say that, but the gravity of that is it's big. This next section here is the U.S. endorsement. Recently declassified national security documents show that the CIA and the U.S. State Department remained primary sponsors of the military junta, which was led by General Jorge Videla. On February 16, 1976, 6 weeks before the coup, Robert Hill, the U.S. ambassador to Argentina, reported to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger that the plans for the coup were underway and that a public relations campaign had been mounted that would cast the new military regime in a positive light. Yeah, you have to manufacture consent. That is a key part of regime overthrow, of totalitarian oppression. Hill added that even though, quote, some executions would probably be necessary, the leaders of the junta remained determined, quote, to minimize any resulting problems with the U.S. On March 25, 1979, 2 days after the coup, William Rogers, Assistant Secretary for Latin America, advised Kissinger that the military takeover of Argentina would result in a, quote, fair amount of repression, probably a good deal of blood. To this warning, Kissinger responded, quote, yes, but that is in our interest. So yeah, they're not making any bones about this. Like they are well aware of the brutality, the murders, and they are on board for that. On March 30th, 1976, Ambassador Hill sent a 7-page assessment of the new regime to Kissinger. In the report, Hill wrote, quote, this is probably the best executed and most civilized coup in Argentine history. 1 week later, U.S. Congress approved a request from the Ford administration, written by Kissinger, to provide $50 million in aid to the new military regime. Yeah. Crazy shit. Now, this next section here is, it says it's called the Jewish Pogrom. I don't know if that's supposed to be program or pogrom. Could be a typo either way, or it could be intentional. So the Jewish Pogrom. With such aid in hand, the junta launched not only its purge of left-wing dissidents, but also an attack on the Jewish community. Bookstores and kiosks were flooded with cheap editions of works by Hitler and Goebbels. Jewish schools, synagogues, newspapers, and businesses were bombed. Prominent Jewish citizens were kidnapped, blackmailed, and intimidated. And a series of crude anti-Semitic programs were aired on Argentine television. In August 1976, unidentified thugs drove through Buenos Aires' Jewish quarter, Barrio Once maybe, strafing shops and synagogues with machine guns. So, if just reading those last couple sentences, or I guess that's one long sentence, you can see that it started out with the bad propaganda. And I'm saying this like one day after Elon Musk seemed to have manipulated Grok once again to spout literal anti Semitic, uh, just Nazi shit and praise Hitler. So if you take this seriously, you can see what the next steps may be. If they're following the same kind of pattern of regime change, fascist overthrow, coups, that kind of thing, and it seems that our overlords are doing exactly that. Morning, Shibbles. Good to see you. So Shibbles says, "Damn, during the times of Munich bombings, 1972." Yeah, a lot of stuff going on concurrently. I've noticed some people making the connections between the Nakba in 1948 and also the genocide of the North Korean people in 1948. A lot of people were posting about that yesterday, making the connection that like North Korea has never tolerated American imperialism or Zionist imperialism, and they have paid the price for that in the decades since, in the form of sanctions, isolation. That's why they're the hermit kingdom. So let's see, back to the book. The walls of the city of Mendoza in northwestern Argentina were painted with swastikas and slogans such as "Be a Patriot, Kill a Jew." In April 1976, the public was invited by two groups calling themselves the Aryan Integral Nationalist Fatherland and the Pious Christian Crusade to attend masses in the Buenos Aires Cathedral, quote, "for the eternal rest of our blood brother in Christ, Adolf Hitler." So yeah, you got some mounting favoritism of Hitler and Nazism. You've got all this increasing, like, quite literal fascist rhetoric, and then you have the violence carried out shortly after. And also note the nods toward like nationalist fatherlands and pious Christian crusades, things that are also becoming much more popular in Western and American culture right now. The next section here is Catholic complicity. On the eve of the coup, General Jorge Videla and other plotters received the blessing of the Archbishop of Parana, Adolfo Tortolo. The day of the takeover itself, the military leaders had a lengthy meeting with the leaders of the bishops' conference. As he emerged from that meeting, Archbishop Tortolo said that although, quote, "the church has its own specific mission, there are circumstances in which it cannot refrain from participating, uh, even when it is a matter of problems related to the specific order of the state." He went on to urge all Argentines to, quote, "cooperate in a positive way with the new government." After thousands had disappeared, the bishop said, quote, "I have no knowledge. I have no reliable proof of human rights being violated in our country," and praised the military regime, saying that the armed forces were simply, quote, "carrying out their duty." So again, all indications of what you will start experiencing as the system continues. The vicar for the army, Bishop Victorio Bonamin, characterized the campaign as a defense of, quote, "morality, human dignity, and ultimately a struggle to defend God. Therefore, I pray for divine protection over this, quote, dirty war in which we are engaged." He told a university audience in December 1977 that the world was divided into, quote, "atheistic materialism and Christian humanism." Though he denied any knowledge of individual cases, he said, quote, "If I could speak with the government, I would tell it that we must remain firm in the positions we're taking. Foreign accusations about disappearances should be ignored." So yeah, if it's happening, it's good, and it's probably not happening anyway, but if it were, we agree with that. The next section here is papal sanction. General Videla, who is currently serving a life sentence for his part in the dirty war, told reporters that he had conferred with Cardinal Raul Francisco Primatesta, the leading Argentine cleric, about the regime's policy of eradicating left-wing activists. He further insisted that he maintained ongoing conversations with Pio Laghi, the papal nuncio, and the leading bishops from Argentina's Episcopal Conference. These dignitaries, he insisted, advised him of the manner in which the junta should deal with all dissidents, including clerics who advocated liberation theology. The general's claim is supported by Bishop Tortolo, who in 1976 said that the clergy was advised of all actions made by the junta, particularly in regard to troublesome priests and nuns. Tortolo made this statement when questioned about the disappearance of two Jesuit priests, Francisco Jalix, it's Jalics, I don't know, and Orlando Yorio, and 6 members of their parish. The disappeared priests were under the charge of Friar Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the principal general of the Society of Jesus in Argentina. They were espousing liberation theology among the slum-dwelling poor of Buenos Aires. So yeah, that was their punishment for being liberation theologists, is they are literally disappeared. The torture chambers, next section here. Friar Jalix and Friar Urio, the two Jesuit priests in Bergoglio's charge, were taken to the notorious Navy School of Mechanics, ESMA, in Buenos Aires. ESMA was the most important of the military government's 340 detention and torture centers. A trip to ESMA typically began with an introduction to, quote, Caroline, an electric prodding rod with two prolonged wires. The visitors were stripped and tied to a steel bed frame. Electricity was applied to the victims, who were periodically doused with water to increase the effects. If the subject was a woman, the interrogators went for the breasts, vagina, or anus. If a man, they applied the wires to the genitals, tongue, or neck. Sometimes victims twitched so uncontrollably that they not only lost control of their bowels, but also shattered their own arms and legs. Friar Patrick Rice, an Irish priest who had worked in the slums and was detained for several days at ESMA, recalled watching his flesh sizzle as the electricity flowed through his body. What Friar Rice most remembered was the smell. Quote, "It was like bacon," he said. Children were tortured in front of their parents, and parents in front of their children. One torturer estimates that about 60 babies passed through the facility, and that all but two, whose heads had been smashed against the walls, were sold to suitable Argentine couples. At ESMA, which also served as a disposal site for other naval camps, corpses were initially buried under the sports field. After the field was filled, the bodies were burned daily at 5:30 in the afternoon, usually after having been cut up with a circular saw. Eventually, the ESMA officials hit upon the idea of aerial disposal at sea. The dead were dumped from airplanes hundreds of miles off the coast of Buenos Aires, along with torture victims who had been drugged into a comatose state. One pilot testified that prisoners fell like ants from the planes. Declassified documents show that Secretary of State Cyrus Vance continued to support the military junta in Argentina. One communique establishes that Vance was fully informed of the situation within ESMA, but opted to allow the horrors to persist. So yeah, pretty gruesome stuff. I had no idea that was coming up. I might have offered like some kind of trigger warning or something. But yeah, this is literally what fascists do. This is what liberal democracies do to leftists. This is what you are going to continue. I can't say it enough. Like, this is what's going to happen if it's not already happening in America, because people are doing absolutely nothing to fight the fascism. Mutual aid and protests are not praxis. And if you think they are, you are a liberal denying that you are a liberal. This next section here is the question of Bergoglio. Friar Jalix and Friar Urio, the two Jesuit priests, were released 5 months after captivity. Having trouble this morning, guys. They were found half naked in a field outside Buenos Aires. Friar Bergoglio later insisted that he had secured their release, but no documentation exists that he had intervened on behalf of the two priests in his charge. Friar Urio, at the 1985 trial of the leaders of the junta, said that Bergoglio had handed them over to the death squad. Quote, "I am sure that he himself," meaning Friar Bergoglio, "gave over the list with our names to the Navy." He further refuted the claim that Bergoglio had saved the lives of the priests, saying, quote, "I do not have any reason to think that he did anything for our release, but much to the contrary." In addition, Friar Urio said that Bergoglio had expelled him from a teaching position at a Jesuit school and had spread false rumors to the Argentine High Command, stating that Urio was, quote, "a communist" and, quote, "a subversive guerrilla who was after women." Friar Jalix also refuted Bergoglio, saying, From the subsequent statements by an official and 30 documents that I was able to access later, we were able to prove without any room for doubt that this man, Bergoglio, did not keep his promise to protect the priests, but on the contrary, he presented a false denunciation to the military. So yeah, exactly what they have been saying the entire time. Friar Jalix, who retreated to a monastery in Germany, said that he is now reconciled with the past because, quote, "forgiveness is a central tenet of Christianity." Better guy than me. I would not be very forgiving of this guy. Journalist Horatio Verbitsky recently uncovered a military document from 1976 in the archives of Argentina's Ministry of Foreign Affairs that appears to provide proof that Friar Bergoglio provided damning testimony about the two priests in his charge to the junta. The document, bearing the signature of Anselmo Orsoyen, who served as the director of the Catholic Division of the on Ministry, appeared on the front page of Pagina of Pagina 12, the Argentine daily newspaper, on March 17th, 2013. It reads, Friar Francisco Jalik's activity of disseverment in the Congregation of Religious Sisters, conflicts of obedience, detained in the Navy School of Mechanics, May 24th, 1976, to, what is that, November 1976? 6 months, accused with Friar Uriel suspicious contact with guerrillas. They lived in a small community which the Jesuit superior dissolved in February of 1976, but they refused to obey the order to leave the community on March 19th. The two were let go. No bishop of Buenos Aires would receive them. This notification was received by Mr. Orsoyen and given to him by Friar Bergoglio, who signed the note with special recommendations not to approve of their requests. Signed Orsoyen, the Vatican, at the time of this writing. Signed Orsoyen. The Vatican, at the time of this writing, continues to affirm Bergoglio's innocence in this matter, insisting that there has never been a, quote, concrete or credible accusation against him. So, yeah. Apparently, it's not only a crime at this point, thankfully, to have taken part in the torturing and the murders, but also to have been one of the people that reported others to the torture and murderers. Let me take a look at the chat. So, yeah. Oh, yeah. So Giorgio in the Instagram chat asks, what is the book? So this is Unholy Alliance by Paul L. Williams. It's about Operation Gladio. Let's see. Shibble says, it's crazy how well they masked fascist control within the general population that is completely unaware. Yeah. It's much like the modern day. But yeah, if anyone is interested, just go to youtube.com. Let me add the lower third here. youtube.com/@tcotepod/streams, and in the description for all of the live stream videos there are links to all these Google documents that I'm reading through if you want to follow along or read ahead, share them with anyone else so you can read the books. This next section here is the theft of babies. But other criminal allegations have been directed against Bergoglio. The grandmothers of the Plaza of Mayo, a human rights group established to locate children stolen during the Dirty War, states that the Jesuits' provincial general failed to assist a family of 5 who were awaiting execution by the death squad. One member of the family, Elena de la Quadra, was a pregnant young woman. The 5 had appealed to the Superior General of the Society of Jesus at the Vatican. The Superior General turned the matter over to Bergoglio, who remained the Provincial General of the Order in Argentina. Bergoglio, in turn, sat on the case for several months, only to pass it off to a local Catholic bishop. The bishop reportedly returned to Bergoglio with a letter from the junta stating that the 4 members of the family had been killed, but the young woman had been kept alive long enough to deliver her baby. No one in the junta apparently wanted to be accused of abortion. The baby was given to a prominent family and could not be returned to its maternal grandmother or any blood relative. Friar Bergoglio later claimed that he had no knowledge of stolen babies, of which there were hundreds, if not thousands, until the collapse of the regime. He said that he did what he could, but had little influence, quote, to save people from the regime. So yeah. And again, just reminding everyone, this is a very heavily footnoted book. If you scroll to the very end, like that sentence about the baby being given to a prominent family and could not be returned to its maternal grandmother or any other blood relative, that's footnote 22. So there are sources for all of this. This is not something that people are making up. These are not just like atrocity porn stories. Like, this is all historical fact, not conspiracy theory. It's been admitted to by the actors themselves. This next section here is he knew everything. Quote, Bergoglio has a very cowardly attitude when it comes to something so terrible as the theft of babies, said Estela de la Quadra, whose husband, brother-in-law, and pregnant sister had been executed. Quote, he doesn't face this reality, and it doesn't bother him. The question is how to save his name, save himself. But he can't keep these allegations from reaching the public. The people know how he is. Mrs. de la Quadra also expressed her outrage that Bergoglio, when serving as the head of the Argentine Bishops' Conference, refused to defrock Friar Christian von Wernick, even after he had been jailed for life in 2007 for 7 killings, 42 abductions, and 34 cases of torture, in which he told victims, quote, God wants to know where your friends are. Von Wernick had served the dictatorship as chaplain of the Buenos Aires Provincial Police. Yeah, so weird that they got this like German guy last name to serve them in their Nazi and fascist goals, right? I wonder where that guy came from. Let me check the chat here again. So, yeah. Quote, I've testified in court that Bergoglio knew everything, that he wasn't, despite what he says, uninvolved. Ms. De La Quadra said, quote, oh, that's her quote. And this next section here is called Criminal Charges. I'll probably read this next section and then we'll switch over to the next book. Criminal charges. In 2005, Argentine human rights attorney Miriam Bregman filed a criminal suit against Bergoglio, who had been elevated to the College of Cardinals, accusing him of complicity in the kidnapping and torture of Friar Urio and Friar Jalix, along with 6 members of their parish. Bergoglio refused to respond to the subpoena to appear in court, invoking his immunity from prosecution under Argentine law as a Vatican official. Quote, he finally accepted to see us in an office alongside Buenos Aires Cathedral, sitting underneath a tapestry of the Virgin Mary, Ms. Bregman said. Quote, it was an intimidating experience. We were very uncomfortable intruding in a religious building. She added that Bergoglio did not provide any significant information on the 2 priests. Quote, he seemed reticent. I left with a bitter taste, she said. Later, in an interview with Sergio Rubin, his official biographer, Bergoglio said that he regularly hid people on church property during the Dirty War and once gave his identity papers to a fugitive with similar facial features so the man could escape across the border. So he sounds like a very nice guy, but we know from the documents he is not. But Bergoglio added, these acts were performed in secret since church leaders were called upon to support the junta. Responding to these comments, Ms. Bregman said that Bergoglio's words condemn him and prove that he condoned the torture and the killing. Quote, the dictatorship could not have operated without this key support, she said. So yeah. And then tomorrow we'll pick up on the section Bergoglio triumphant. So I'm assuming they're just referring to the fact that he's not going to be held accountable or go to prison for any of this stuff, as the fascist operators typically do not. Anyway, so let's switch over to the Western Marxism book. So now this one is Western Marxism, written by Domenico Losurdo, translated and edited by Gabriel Rockhill. So now we're on to section 8 or chapter 8, Adorno's Imperial Universalism. It is possible to ascertain an element of regression in Horkheimer and Theodore Adorno. Regarding, quote, fascism, Dialectic of Enlightenment, the book they jointly published in the 1940s, observes that before its spread and triumph in the heart of Europe itself, quote, totalitarian capitalism and the totalitarian order had involved only, quote, the poor and savages. The preparatory stages of fascism were identified with the violence perpetrated by the great Western powers against the colonial peoples and consummated in the heart of the capitalist metropole against the poor and marginalized, trapped in a sort of concentration camp, the workhouse. It was acknowledged, to some extent, that Nazi fascism had made its first attempts at expansionism and colonial rule. That Nazi fascism had made its first attempts at expansionism and colonial rule. Okay, it is true that the victims were, quote, savages rather than peoples with their own history and culture who sought to build an independent national state. However, it was still a condemnation of colonialism and the nexus between Nazism and colonialism. All this disappears without leaving a trace a few years later, with the coming of the Cold War, when the anti-colonialist revolution merged with the international communist movement and, reaching the Middle East, put into question the policies and even the existence of the State of Israel. At this point, the polemic against the revolutionary agitation of the Third World became a constant theme and was developed in the name of universalism. In Negative Dialectics, Adorno rejected the Hegelian category of the, quote, spirit of the people. That is, the attention to the national question as, quote, reactionary and regressive compared to the Kantian universal of his time. Humanity now seen, quote, as affected by nationalism and provincialism in the era of world conflicts and of the potential for a global organization of the world. Even worse, it was a devotion to a, quote, fetish, a collective subject, the nation, in which individuals disappear without a trace. So now this is a great stance. Like, that sounds really good to people who are raised in individualism, who are raised to see the East as scary, totalitarian, dystopian, authoritarian, even if their own country is far more guilty of all of those things. All of this sounds good. Like, individualism really rings true with the Western left. And that has been their dismantling. It was a stance that, in retrospect, delegitimized the revolution promoted and directed by the National Liberation Front of Algeria, a people and a country undoubtedly more provincial, more backward, and less cosmopolitan than the France against which they were waging an insurgency. It also delegitimized the anti-colonial revolutions taking place under Adorno's eyes, beginning with the one led by the National Liberation Front of Vietnam. In the latter case, the philosopher's negative judgment was unequivocal and without nuance. Quote, in the security of America, an emigrant could endure the news of Auschwitz. It would be difficult to believe that Vietnam is robbing anyone of sleep, especially since every opponent of colonial wars must know that the Viet Cong, for their part, used Chinese methods of torture. See, if you can just find anything that you can say bad about the people who are rising up against their oppressors, well, then you can just side with the oppressors. It's very easy to do because it requires you to do nothing from inside that oppressor driven society. It's not a coincidence that people living inside the imperial core tend to always choose the narrative that goes along and makes them feel good about absolutely doing absolutely nothing to resist their empire. Let's see. Adorno had made this declaration in 1969. The year before, the My Lai massacre had occurred. A brigade at the orders of Lieutenant William Calley did not hesitate to kill 347 civilians, including the old, women, children, and newborns. It was the irrefutable confirmation of the genocidal practices by which Washington's army disgraced itself. Still today, 40 years after the end of that war, no count exists of the Vietnamese killed by the dioxin sprayed without concern on the civilian population by U.S. aircraft. All this was compared to Auschwitz and reduced to a trifle, and such trifles did not make Adorno lose sleep. On the contrary, he mocked those who did lose sleep because of it, rather than because of the, quote, Chinese methods of torture attributed to the Viet Cong, who were, after all, the victims. It is a page that dishonors philosophy, but it is a page that does not constitute an isolated incident en route. Even as historical reconstruction and philosophy of history, Adorno did not pay any attention nor show any sympathy for the victims of the West and its expansionist march. Quote, even the assaults of the conquistadors on ancient Mexico and Peru, which must have been experienced therein like invasions from another planet, murderously advanced the expansion of rational bourgeois society, irrationality for the Aztecs and Incas, all the way to the conception of, quote, one world, teleologically inherent in the principle of that society. I'm not sure what Adorno means by that, but to start off saying that like they were like expanding rational bourgeois society by committing genocide against Native people, it's a hell of a take. Albeit in an objective and, quote, irrational way, did colonial expansion contribute to bringing the human race closer together, to realizing a world finally united? One world is the quote, collective subject, in which the individual subject and even individual peoples, quote, disappear without a trace, to pick up the critique by Adorno directed at Hegel. In any case, we have to ask, did colonial expansion not dig an unbridgeable gulf between the world's peoples, conferring on the superior race of the masters the right to enslave and sacrifice en masse the undermen and the Untermenschen? If we move from the discovery conquest of America to the French Revolution, the framework doesn't change. The quote, the specific privation, at least of the Parisian masses, might have ignited the movement, while in other countries where it was not so acute, the bourgeois process of emancipation succeeded without a revolution and at first did not touch the more or less absolutist form of domination. On the theme of the rise of modernity, different countries are compared without considering the colonial question. Quote, the more or less absolutist form of domination is denounced with reference to the Bourbon monarchy and Jacobinism in France, but never the power exercised over the black slaves by the white masters. The latter regularly held the office of president in the United States' early years. Yeah, so that is something that's always curious. Is like you have people who are living in Western societies, even like when slavery exists, and they are still denouncing the Eastern societies as if they are somehow worse, even if they don't have that same kind of thing, even if they are like making proletarian-led revolutions to overthrow colonial expansion. Like, the hypocrisy is astounding, basically. Polemically turning on its head Hegel's great dictum, quote, the truth is the whole, Adorno instead claimed the whole is the false. Even when he idealized the West's dominant country and the West itself, Adorno confirmed the validity of the aphorism in the quote in the phenomenology of mind, not the one he proclaimed in Minima Moralia. Hegel makes clear that in attenuating the social conflict beyond the Atlantic, quote, the outlet of colonization had played a large role. The view of the whole allowed the great philosopher of the dialectic to grasp the nexus between the freedom of the white community and the total unfreedom of the native population, which suffered a merciless process of expropriation, deportation, and decimation. This escaped a vision that infantilizing and absolutizing a particular aspect of the reality investigated ended up losing sight of the whole. A final consideration: the return to Kant by Adorno was anything but convincing. In the essay, quote, Toward Perpetual Peace, which Negative Dialectics alludes to, there is a memorable denunciation not only of colonial slavery and of colonialism, but also of, quote, universal monarchy as synonymous with a, quote, soulless despotism, founded on the oppression of nations and therefore destined to fail. Quote, Nature has wisely divided the peoples from one another, and this allows for, quote, differences in languages and religions. The attempt to unite the world under the banner of international despotism would clash with the resistance of the peoples and would result, if anything, in, quote, anarchy. On another occasion, tracing the historical and philosophical results of the French Revolution, Kant observed that if patriotism runs the risk of sliding into exclusivity and of losing sight of the universal, an abstract love of humanity, quote, cannot fail to dissipate this inclination through its excessive generality, and risks in this way reducing itself to an empty declaration. It is a question, then, of reconciling, quote, global patriotism with, quote, local patriotism, or with, quote, love of country. Whoever is authentically universalist, quote, in fealty to his country, must have an inclination to promote the well-being of the entire world. Looking closely, Adorno laid claim to a philosopher who had already criticized and refuted his argument. So yeah, I noticed that like so many of these middle chapters are basically takedowns of each specific philosopher who contributed to the collective mindset that is the Western left, that is the turning Marxism into an academic pursuit rather than a revolutionary militant struggle, um, looking down on the ones who actually do that revolutionary struggle and succeed at it, and then demonizing them as like more authoritarian or just as bad as the capitalists who are oppressing you, while you live off the oppression of the people that they are oppressing worse than yourself if you're in a privileged position to be in the imperial core and making a living off the super profits. Good to see some people in the Instagram chat. Thank you guys. Let's see, how much longer do I have with this one? Okay, I got a few more minutes with this one, so we'll go on to chapter 9 here. So, chapter 9, whoever is unwilling to talk about colonialism should also keep quiet about capitalism and fascism. With the anti-colonial revolution in full swing, the two leading exponents of critical theory did not limit themselves to counterposing their imperial universalism. Let's read this eloquent declaration from the 1960s. Quote, Joy makes men better. It is impossible for happy men, capable of enjoyment and who see many possibilities for being happy, to be particularly evil. Of Kant and Goethe, it is said that they were great connoisseurs of wines, which means that when they were alone, they were certainly not tormented by jealousy, and they had instead the possibility of enjoyment. They were enriched by 75 experiences. This sounds like trying to do like the, what do you call it, brat, like Joy Kamala campaign. It sounds like really nothing new is new. It's all just like rehashes of the same propaganda that's been going on for over a century at this point. So this is how things stood. Nothing good could come from the, quote, wretched of the earth, so dear to Frantz Fanon, or from the anti-colonial movement. And yet, this is the same Horkheimer who recognized that, quote, the industrialists approved of Hitler's program. Men who were presumably happy because perhaps they were, quote, great connoisseurs of wines, no less than were Kant and Goethe, but who had shown themselves to be, quote, particularly evil in giving the green light to a program of war, colonial expansionism, and annihilation. However, the motivation in question is also present in Adorno. For him, too, the source of evil is, quote, resentment of classes and of peoples in subaltern conditions. And the rancor that, quote, resentment strikes Resentment strikes every happiness, even its own, and so a consequence is that, quote, satiety becomes a term of rebuke a priori, even though the only thing bad about it would be that there are those who have, quote, nothing to eat, or sorry, who have nothing to eat. This last issue was a problem that could be solved, quote, technically. That is, not through political action, but by the disinterested, sorry, not through political action by the disinherited, but by the but by the beneficent intervention of the classes and countries that possess a superior culture and wealth and power. So yeah, that's the old gambit where you say the way to reduce inequality is not for the people who have been wronged to address that wrongdoing by taking any of the wealth that was stolen from them in any kind of militant or violent fashion from the people who directly took it from them. It is to ask the people who took it to nicely redistribute that wealth um, through like polite and official political institutions, um, or possibly some other means, maybe even private ones or religious ones, but definitely not militant struggle that has proven to work to do that. In his time, Nietzsche had rejected any objectivity on the social question, putting it in the category of the ressentiment of failures. Analogously, the two principal exponents of critical theory likewise deal with the social question at the international level. We can therefore understand that the main target of Adorno's polemic is the revolutionary agitation of the Third World. Quote, today, the fascist fantasy undeniably blends with the nationalism of the so-called underdeveloped countries, which already are no longer called that, but rather, quote, developing countries. So also during the war, in slogans about Western plutocracies and proletarian nations, sympathy was expressed with those who felt that they had come up short in the imperialist competition and wanted to find a seat at the table. It's hard to say if and to what extent this tendency is already embedded in the anti-civilizational, anti-Western current of the German tradition. Whether in Germany, too, there is a convergence of fascist and communist nationalism. After having psychologically delegitimized them as an expression of ressentiment, using Nietzsche's polemic against the socialist movement, the critical theorist condemns the anti-colonialist and third world movement also ethically and politically. Behind the agitation is not the desire for justice in international relations, but the aspiration to participate in the imperialist banquet. In this framework, there is no place for the anti-colonialist revolution. The contenders are merely satisfied and now peaceful imperialists and potential imperialists who are more aggressive and dangerous. And that's fantastic because you notice that still goes on today. It is not that there is only one empire, the US and NATO and the European countries who are working together and who all jointly use American military bases that are spread out around the world, which no other country has this network of. It's not that that is just the one empire and that the other countries that are resisting that are anti-imperialist, and that it's that they are also aspirationally imperialist. They may not even be imperialist yet, but they want to be, or they could be, or maybe they even are because just the intent is bad enough. Uh, Lenin, I don't think Lenin ever said that intent to commit imperialism is imperialism. It's usually when you actually are uh, dominating like the world market and subjugating other countries to your will using that force. But I don't know. Maybe it's just when you're mean. Maybe when you have a big country and an army. Maybe when you do things militarily. That's all imperialism. Schill says straight mind wars. Yeah. Basically, what I'm trying to say is like the people who think that Russia is imperialist or China is imperialist are not serious people. They're not serious critics. They're not academics. They're not serious people. They're just uh, liberals masking all of their imperialist apologia for U.S. nationalism in leftist rhetoric. But to what political reality does Adorno allude when he denounces the substantially fascist character of the quote nationalism of the so-called underdeveloped countries, or the quote convergence of fascist and communist nationalism? We are in 1959. At that time, only two countries were nurturing a quote fascist fantasy in a strict sense: Portugal and Spain. Neither of these two was part of the Third World. They were colonial powers, and both considered themselves integral to the West. The first was a founding member of NATO. The second was already on the way to joining this political military organization and would join in 1982. How can we explain then Adorno's discourse? 3 years earlier, there had been the colonial expedition by there had been the colonial expedition by Great Britain, France, and Israel against Egypt of Nasser, which had nationalized the Suez Canal, and which, enjoying the support of the quote socialist camp, had called on the Arab world to throw off the colonial and semi-colonial yoke. On that occasion, Anthony Eden, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, which until that moment had controlled the Suez Canal, and a loyal supporter of the empire, portrayed Nasser as a quote sort of Islamic Mussolini, and as a quote paranoid, with the same mental structure as Hitler. Notice how they're doing that to Putin nowadays. Anybody that opposes the Israeli genocide or the U.S. empire or NATO expansion, they are Hitler. They're Putler. Everybody else is Hitler except for Netanyahu, Trump, Biden, the people actually doing the genocides. At this point, we find a perfect coincidence in the ideology of colonial war and in the philo-colonialist false consciousness of Adorno. The nationalism of Egypt, quote, underdeveloped, but determined to recover its national sovereignty and territorial integrity, was fascist, and the support of it by Moscow and Beijing constituted the confirmation of the, quote, convergence of fascist and communist nationalism. So yeah, if anybody supports the Axis resistance, you can point to any kind of socially regressive policy that any of those countries have and say that's the fascist alliance now. You can say that those are actually all the bad guys because the countries that are doing it and aligning are not perfect socialist utopias. And again, it doesn't matter if the U.S. imprisons more people, conducts more genocides, has more military bases, is more repressive at home or abroad. None of that matters. You have to just cherry pick anything you can to demonize the countries that the U.S. is against and then claim that you are the true anti-imperialist. I'm going to bookmark this in here for today. So yeah, tomorrow we'll pick up. We're still in chapter 9. Looks like we're going to talk. Oh, we got like a couple paragraphs of it left. So, and then we'll be on to chapter 10, Marcuse and the difficult rediscovery of imperialism. So now I'm going to switch over to the third book, and that is Peter Dale Scott's book, Drugs, Oil, and War, the United States and Afghanistan, Colombia, and Indochina. And this is another one that is very related to Gladio. Like the Gladio stuff comes up a lot in the Western Marxism book, but it really is tied in here. This is like the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s version of Operation Gladio. Again, meaning the international drug trafficking for profit, and then using those profits to fund clandestine operations to further that same cause. It's just like a perpetual vicious cycle. Maureen Orth heard from Matteo Falco, head of international narcotics control for the State Department under Jimmy Carter, that the CIA and ISI together encouraged the Mujahideen to addict Soviet troops. So yeah, they purposely distributed drugs among the Soviet troops to hamper them. But the plans went further. In 1984, during a secret visit by CIA Director Casey to Pakistan, quote, Casey startled his Pakistani host by proposing that they take the Afghan war into enemy territory, into the Soviet Union itself. Pakistani intelligence officers, partly inspired by Casey, began independently to train Afghans and funnel CIA supplies for scattered strikes against military installations, factories, and storage depots within Soviet territory. The attacks later alarmed U.S. officials in Washington, who saw military raids on Soviet territory as, quote, an incredible escalation. According to Graham Fuller, then a senior U.S. intelligence CIA official who counseled against any such raids. Quote, thus it was, according to Pakistani Brigadier Muhammad Yusuf, the U.S. that put in train a major escalation of the war, which over the next 3 years culminated in numerous cross-border raids and sabotage missions north of the Amu Darya. According to Ahmed Rashid, quote, in 1986, the secret services of the United States, Great Britain, and Pakistan agreed on a plan to launch guerrilla attacks into Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. The task was given to the ISI's favorite Mujahideen leader, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who by this time was supplementing his CIA and Saudi income with the proceeds of his heroin labs, quote, in the Kohai Sultan area of Pakistan, where the ISI was in total control. For some reason, that word keeps getting like redacted from this. I don't know why that is. It's always at the end of a sentence. At the same time, the CIA also helped ISI and Saudi Arabia distribute in the Soviet Union thousands of Qurans that had been translated into Uzbek, an important contribution to the spread of Islamism in Central Asia today. Casey was an oil man, and his Central Asian Initiative of 1984 was made at a time when the right-wing oil interests in Texas already had their eyes on Caspian Basin oil. His cross-border guerrillas, recruited from ethnic Uzbeks and Tajiks, evolved in time into heroin-financed Islamic groups like the IMU, who became the scourge of Central Asia in the 1990s. There was also a second question. How far back did the use of Hekmatyar and drugs go, and who originated it? Did CIA initiate the May 1979 contact with Hekmatyar as part of Carter's and Brzezinski's national policy? Or did Abedi, Haq, and company, enjoying a special relationship with pro-Saudi elements in the CIA, arrange the contact on behalf of drug interests that would soon profit handsomely? Or did the CIA strengthen the drug trafficking position of its friends, such as BCCI and Fazl Haq, because it feared Soviet-backed and heroin-financed intelligence activities among Muslims like among Muslims of men like Rifat Assad, who controlled the drugs and laboratories of Lebanon's Bekaa Valley? So yeah, there's like conflicting but somewhat aligned motivations here, and it seems like it's just impossible for us to really know uh, the extent of the corruption. But just from what we can tell, from what is already known, like from official documents that have been released, you can tell what at least some of the interests in here are, and it's all bad. It's all just like this corrupt drug trafficking for the purposes of far right goals. Let's see. If that question can yet be definitively answered, it is clear that if that question cannot yet be definitively answered, it is clear that BCCI and its affiliated Gokal shipping interest and possibly Global International Airways soon formed the backbone of the CIA ISI arms pipeline to Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And the United States, fully conscious of Hekmatyar's drug trafficking and anti-Americanism, never exerted pressure to have the ISI deny him U.S. aid. This inaction is the more striking because of Hekmatyar's conspicuous failure to contribute to the Mujahideen military campaign. So yeah, he wasn't even helping them militarily, and they were still tolerating his anti-American views, obviously his drug trafficking. So it's like, why would they, unless they're making money from it? 1959. This brings me to the original thesis of my 1972 book, The War Conspiracy. In 1959, drug trafficking elements in Southeast Asia, fearing the loss of their opium sources and connections, had simulated a phony war crisis in Laos. I suspected but could not prove that they did so in order to secure a new basis for drug operations in that country with a CIA airline, the KMT partly controlled, Civil Air Transport, known after 1959 as Air America. This simulation involved collusion with elements in the CIA and U.S. armed forces who shared the KMT goal of reconquering China. Lacking certain proof, I formulated this hypothesis very tentatively in 1972, and again in the new preface I wrote to the book in early 2001. However, events since 9/11 emboldened me to raise it again as a question. In 1959, as again in 1979 and 2001, the local drug trade was threatened by political developments, and the threat vanished after both a CIA-backed escalation and the elevation to power of drug trafficking elements. The pressures in 1959 were coming from tribesmen in northeastern Laos, from Burma, and from Thailand. For years, KMT drugs had been routinely, quote, seized by Thai border police and then sold locally or to Hong Kong traffickers, to the profit of the CIA's puppet in Thailand, Phao Srianon. This came to an abrupt end in 1959 when, quote, Field Marshal Sarit, Thanarat of Thailand, unleashed a full military assault on the opium trade. At 1 minute after midnight on July 1st, 1959, Sarit's forces swept the country, raiding opium dens, seizing their stocks, and confiscating opium pipes. Speaking to his people, Sarit declared that, quote, 1st of July 1959 can be considered a date of historical significance because it began the first chapter of a new age in the history of the Thai nation. I recount in part 3 how a new chapter in the history of Laos began with the conspiratorial, quote, crisis only 2 weeks later, on July 16, 1959. Since 1958, KMT forces under pressure in Burma had begun relocating to towns like Ban Hoi Sai, and Nam Ta in northwestern Laos that would soon become opium centers and CIA bases. By March 1959, they were being supplied in Laos by what Bernard Fall called, quote, an airlift of unknown planes, almost certainly from the Taiwanese airline Civil Air Transport, which fronted for the CIA proprietary, known since 1959 as Air America. The CIA owned 40% of the company. KMT bankers owned 60%. The planes had been supplying the KMT opium bases continuously since 1951. The result of the phony Laotian crisis of July to August 1959 was to give official White House sanction to a continuous Air America airlift to Laos. Air America planes soon began the major airlift to Hamong or Mayo camps in northeastern Laos as well. By 1965, they became the primary means of exporting the Hmong's traditional cash crop, opium, and by 1968 were also carrying heroin. Apparently most of this ended up in traditional KMT networks through Hong Kong to the United States. The 1959, quote, crisis was the first of a series that between 1961 and 1964 would lead to greater and greater U.S. involvement in first Laos and then Vietnam. Air America's support for drug trafficking rebel Laotian leader Phomi Nosavan contributed to these crises. Clearly, the quote crises combined stimulus from outside the U.S. government with high-level support inside it. We now know that a plan for a KMT reinvasion of South China, a plan first authorized by Truman in 1951, continued to be supported long after the Korean War by some high-level generals and CIA officials. These ranged from extremists like Air Force General Curtis LeMay, who wrote privately about, quote, nuking the, I'm not even going to say this word, it's a C word for Chinese people, to CIA Deputy Director Ray Klein, who had served as a CIA station chief in Taipei. The plan was revived by right-wing oppositionists in 1959 to 1960, in the 1959 to 62 period, when the old McCarthyite question, "Who lost China?" was added a new one: "Who lost Cuba?" You love to see the U.S. expansionists and the imperialists taking L's, though. But yeah, you can see like it literally affects their collective psychology. Like it makes them more fascist when they lose, because then they feel like they have to gain something back, or like they have to get more aggressive, as if they're not like controlling the whole fucking world. Gamer James says, if the combined wealth of all the world's billionaires was liquidated, it would be enough to give every adult and child in Gaza $7 million to fund a new life somewhere peaceful. If the monsters who run everything are dead set on ethnic cleansing, at least be fair about it. Yeah. The people who are in charge of ethnic cleansing, though, are not going to go after the rich and powerful, unfortunately. Perhaps the most vocal advocate of the plan from 1959 to 65 was the KMT-sponsored Asian People's Anti-Communist League, after 1966 the World Anti-Communist League, whose member agency at its Taiwan headquarters also sponsored the airlift to the KMT opium camps of Western Laos. So yeah, very literally, if you're an anti-communist, you're not only involved and in bed with fascists, but the entire global heroin and hard drug trade and the mafias. Going back to the Gladio book, you're also involved with like these secret Freemasonic organizations, literal Nazis, just the absolute worst people. Don't be an anti-communist is the point there. The KMT's stake in the CAT airlift to its troops in the, quote, Fertile Triangle became obvious in 1961 when Fang Chi, a member of the KMT Central Supervisory Committee and Secretary General of the Free China Relief Agency, FCRA, admitted responsibility for an unlisted CAT plane that had just been shot down over Thailand by the Burmese Air Force. The unpublicized visit to Laos of Fang Chi in the weeks immediately preceding the phony Laos, quote, invasion of 1959, suggests that the narcotics traffic, as well as the Pathet Lao activity, may have been a reason why CAT's planes inaugurated their flights in that year into the opium-growing Mao areas of Sem Noe province. But KMT machinations fomenting a phony Laos crisis in 1959 would have gone unheeded had it not been for support from the local CIA station and higher. A key role was played by the influential CIA ally Joseph Alsop, an old China hand and columnist whose inflammatory reports from Laos helped trigger the U.S. authorization for Charter Air America Charter Air America airlift. We should not be surprised that the CIA and its friends took steps to protect and strengthen the KMT drug traffic in 1959, at a time when that traffic was being challenged. For a decade, the CIA and its part-owned proprietary CAT had played a key role in building up the traffic as the most dependable CIA asset in East and Southeast Asia. The origins of that collaboration merit closer study. Yeah, and they have like another extensive notes section here. Again, just a very heavily sourced book. If you're looking for all the, there's tons of further reading here. It's got like 39 footnotes. Let's see. Oh no, it goes on. We're up to 50 notes. Nope, still going on. Sorry. When do I get to the next chapter here? Sorry, guys. Okay, so it's chapter 3. The origins of the drug proxy strategy, the KMT, Burma, and U.S. organized crime. So yeah, this is going to have to get into Gladio shit. This is literally what we've been talking about in the first book. So there were 98 notes for that last section. Again, just saying it's heavily footnoted. And for anybody who's not familiar, of course, the KMT is the Kuomintang. These are the people who lost the civil war to Mao in China, then fled to the island of Taiwan, and were only able to do that and stay there successfully up until now because they had U.S. backing, because the U.S. wanted to protect these fascists, because it was strategic to their interest in fighting the Chinese communists, and always has been since then. So again, the origins of the drug proxy strategy, the KMT, Burma, and U.S. organized crime. After World War II, it should have been possible to contain the global opium traffic, which had been severely weakened by the interruption of maritime commerce. The expulsion of the Kuomintang from mainland China in 1949 and the founding of the People's Republic were followed by the elimination of the opium crops in Yunnan and Sichuan that had been perhaps the chief source of world supply, as well as a source of local income for the KMT regime. But even before the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, there was support in Washington for strengthening the remnant KMT armies in Burma. On April 10, 1950, the Joint Chiefs of Staff proposed a program to exploit the, quote, renewed vitality of the Chinese Nationalist Force. Under the program, the Office of Policy Coordination, the OPC, worked under private cover to supply the Chinese Nationalist Forces of Li Mi in Burma, who was working for the CIA by May 1950, if not earlier. The true author of the plan, as noted previously, page 2, was General Claire Chennault, whose airline CAT became the OPC Li Mi supply line. General Li Mi's army soon proved itself to be no threat to the Chinese People's Republic, to the new Chinese People's Republic. Its two attempted invasions in 1951 and 52 were easily repulsed by Yunnanese militia after advances of only 60 miles. As a force to restore the supply of opium to the KMT, however, Li Mi and his army were so successful that Burma's total annual harvest of opium increased from fewer than 40 tons before World War II to between 300 and 400 tons by 1962. Quote, by the end of the 1950s, Burma, Laos, and Thailand together had... so there's like a block quote and then it continues somewhere else. Is this the end of the book? What the fuck happened? Oh no. I'm sorry, you guys. It looks like the copy of the book I have just like ends here on page 77, which is labeled page 59, and then it just fucking ends here, right in the middle of a sentence. The footnote that I skipped over, or was trying to skip over to get to the next section, it says, I regret that when I wrote this chapter, I had not seen Sterling Seagrave's useful but tendentious Lords of the Rim, the Invisible Empire of the Overseas Chinese, New York, Putnam's 1995, especially chapter 10. Seagrave argues that the post-war opium polity linking the KMT 93rd Division and Thailand had its roots in secret 1944 meetings in Yunnan between the M, the Thais, and a Japanese officer, Suji Masanobu, who was close to Chinese General Tai Li. This book, page 61. All right, well, then I guess that means we are unceremoniously at the end of the Peter Dale Scott book. Sorry, folks. So I do have another thing that I could read, if I can pull it up quickly enough. Let's see. This was sent to me by a follower who suggested in my Discord that we take up a reading group, like a reading and discussion group in the Discord. So I mentioned I've already been trying to do that on these daily live reading hour streams. So let me see if I can pull up this thing that they sent me. Okay, now this is from Marxist.org /reference/archive/Stalin/works/1907/04/13.htm. So it's JV Stalin, or Caucasian Clowns. This is a quick one. I looked at it the other day, so I'll read through this really quick. It's only a few paragraphs. So this is, the source is Works, Volume 2, 1907 to 1913. The Menshevik newspaper Lakvari flew into a rage over our articles. Evidently, our accusations hit the mark. It makes, of course, a very amusing spectacle. What's it all about? We wrote that the Duma's swing to the right does not surprise us. Why? Because the Duma is dominated by the liberal bourgeoisie, and this bourgeoisie is entering into an alliance with the government and breaking with the workers and peasants. Hence the weakness of the Duma. And the fact that the workers and revolutionary peasants are not dragging at the tail of the anti-revolutionary Duma, the fact that they are indeed breaking with the Duma majority, shows that the people of our country are more politically conscious than the French people were in the 18th century. Hence, again, the weakness of the Duma. That is how we explained the Duma's weakness and its swing to the right. It turns out that on reading this explanation, the Mensheviks' hearts sank into their boots, and they howled in horror. Quote, "No, if the explanation offered by the Bolsheviks were true, we would have to shrug our shoulders and say that it is all up with the Russian Revolution." See Lakvari number 6. Poor fellows, they believe in their own revolutionariness less than they believe in that of the cadets. The liberals are betraying the revolution, hence the revolution has grown weaker. The workers and revolutionary peasants, it appears, are a mere cipher. Woe to you if you have no more penetration than that. They are not even faithful to themselves. For example, 18 months ago, the same Mensheviks wrote something different in their newspaper, uh, Shkivi. Quote, "The December strike repelled the bourgeoisie from revolution and made it conservative. The further development of the revolution must proceed against the liberals. Will the revolution be able to do this? That will depend on who will be driving the force of the revolution. Here too, of course, the proletariat is the leader of the revolution. It will be unable to carry the revolution to the end unless it has a powerful and faithful ally, and this ally is the peasantry, and only the peasantry. See Skeevy number 12. Yes, that is what the Mensheviks said when they were adhering to the standpoint of social democracy. But now, having turned their backs on social democracy, they are singing a different song and are proclaiming the liberals as the hub of the revolution, as the saviors of the revolution. After all this, they have the effrontery to assure us that the Caucasian Mensheviks are not clowns, that they do not deck themselves in social democratic apparel in order to cover up their cadet natures. Quote, "How did it happen?" The Mensheviks ask, that in the first Duma the cadets acted more boldly, demanded a ministry responsible to the Duma, etc. How is it to be explained that on the day after the Duma was dispersed, the cadets signed the Viborg Manifesto? Why are they not behaving the same way today? To this question, the political philosophy of the Bolsheviks provides no reply, nor can it do so. It is no use trying to console yourselves, poor frightened comrades. We answered that question long ago. The present Duma is more colorless because the proletariat is now more politically conscious and united than it was in the period of the first Duma, and this is pushing the liberal bourgeoisie to the side of reaction. Get that well into your minds once and for all, pro-liberal comrades. Quote, "The more consciously the proletariat fights, the more counter-revolutionary the bourgeoisie becomes." That is our explanation. And how do you explain the colorlessness of the second Duma, dear comrades? For example, in number 4 of Lakvari, you wrote that the Duma's weakness and colorlessness are due to, quote, "the people's lack of political consciousness and organization." You yourselves say that the first Duma was bolder. It follows, therefore, that at the time the people were politically conscious and organized. The second Duma is more colorless. Hence, this year the people are less, quote, "politically conscious and organized" than they were last year, and hence the revolution and the political consciousness of the people have receded. Is this not what you wanted to say, comrades? Is this not how you wanted to justify your gravitation toward the cadets, dear friends? Woe to you and your muddled, quote, "logic" if you think of continuing to remain clowns. I love it. He's just like me. He's like literally just calling out the grifters and the frauds and the suits. Um, you love to see it. You love to see people calling out who are not, like, anyone who is not a real one, especially if there's such a real one as fucking Stalin himself. All right, so I guess that means we're done with the Peter Dale Scott book. I will take suggestions. I have plenty of other suggestions from people, but if anybody has any, feel free to DM them to me on any of the platforms. Instagram, I probably will not see your messages, sorry, but if you hit me up on Discord in the server or in DMs, I will see that. You can also email truecrimesoftheempire@gmail.com. Probably the best way if you want to send me like a PDF of something you'd like me to read on here. But yeah, I will confer with some comrades in some various places and see what I should replace that Peter Dale Scott book with now that we're finished that one. And that's pretty much how I'll run these. I'll just keep replacing books as I finish them and then do 20 minutes on 3 different books for an hour, each reading hour. Hope you guys enjoy these. I'm having a lot of fun doing